Uh, Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in Athens, and I admire your patience after this long day of discussions. As Benny said, we worked together on this book for almost 10 years, but the book is a mega history. 30 years, all of Anatolia, 3 main Christian groups, and many subsects. It's sometimes difficult to grasp the story. How would a 30-year genocide feel to someone living through the period? How did it unfold on the ground? My purpose here in this talk is to elucidate this by using a kind of micro-history, moving from the macro to the micro. I chose the town of Trabzon, specifically because it involves the extermination of both Armenians and Greeks, and because it exemplifies, during these 30 years, the themes we discussed in the book. Almost every kind of method used in this tragic course of events, first by the Ottoman and then by the Turkish authorities, against the non-Muslim inhabitants, but also the fact that many honest Muslims resisted the instructions from high above and managed to save lives. One word of explanation. When describing the perpetrators from the end of the 19th century until the 1920s, I do not use the word Turks here, but rather Muslims. The reason is not that Islam in and of itself, and here I disagree with Benny, it's not that Islam in and of itself is an explanation for these actions, but because this is the only common denominator of the people who committed these crimes. It was not an ethnic issue per se. In Trabzon, for instance, the perpetrators were Turks, Kurds, Laz, Circassians, Chechens, etc. They shared their religion and a vague sense of Islamic nationalism. I'm sure most of you are acquainted with the long history of Trabzon, but for the few who are not so familiar, let me just summarize in a few words. Trabzon in Turkey, also known as Trapezus, Trapezund, and Trebizond, is an ancient city in the eastern part of the Black Sea shore, residing close to what today is the border between Turkey and Georgia. I jump over a long history and say that after the Fourth Crusade, the sack of Constantinople, it became the capital of an autonomous state, which carried on the Byzantine name under the Komnenos dynasty. In 1461, the city was conquered by Mehmed the Conqueror and added to the Ottoman Empire. Emperor Komnenos capitulated, was sent to Constantinople with his family, and executed several months later. In the following centuries, several demographic changes can be seen. Turks settled in the town, and much of its population, the Laz people, converted to Islam. According to some estimates, in the 19th century, Trebizond was a multi-ethnic seaside town inhabited by some 26,000 Muslims, mostly Laz and Turks, 15,000 Greeks, and 7,000 Armenians. We're not sure about the exact numbers. It's very difficult to ascertain them. Now, in the late 19th century, where our story begins, with the first stirrings of nationalism in Anatolia, and with increased abuse of the Christians, mainly in the east, several Armenian revolutionary committees were formed. There were few activists in Trabzon, and although they were not popular with the Armenian population, the authorities were seriously worried. In February 1895, the American consul in Sivas, Dr. Jewett, raised the alarm concerning what he called a contemplated assassination of the Christians. There were rampages against Christians in town in 1895, but the actual massacre in Trabzon happened only in the wake of riots in Istanbul. This is, by the way, the sort of the area we're talking about. And the dotted areas are where the Greeks were residing in Anatolia. On October 1, 1895, there was an Armenian demonstration in Istanbul that rapidly evolved into an anti-Christian pogrom in which many Christians were killed. But in Trabzon, as in other towns in the provinces, this pogrom was described as an Armenian rebellion against the government. Local Muslims, and I quote, seemed to infer that all the Armenians were banded together in armed rebellion against the government. The next week, and here are the towns where pogroms and massacres happened in 1894 to 96. The next week, on October 8, 1895, at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the massacre in Trabzon began, like a clap of thunder in a clear sky, as one observer said. Ottoman authorities later claimed that it was impossible to determine on which side the brawl began, and that Armenians fired at random on soldiers, police, and citizens alike. But other observers, not to mention Armenian witnesses, offered a different story. According to an unsigned report, probably by an American missionary, Armenians were shot down in the street or sitting quietly at their shop doors. Some were slashed with swords. The attackers passed through the quarters, killing the men and older boys, generally permitting the women and younger children to live. For 5 hours, this horrid work of human butchery went on. The police and soldiers probably aided the mob. They were mingled with the armed men. Apparently, they made sure that the right ones, that is, only Armenians who tried to resist, were killed, and also that an offer of surrender might be made to all those that were found unarmed and unresisting. After a full day of murder and plunder, the Vali and his troops stepped in and stopped the massacre, but the violence spilled over into the rural areas. A French consul in Erzurum noted, close to Trabzon, the whole country between Trabzon and Erzurum is devastated. Nearly all the villages are burned, and in many cases the male population is entirely wiped out. According to the British consul Longworth, the attackers spared only communities that had dressed as Muslims and professed their conversion to Islamism. Most of Trabzon's Armenians escaped death by fleeing to consulates and public buildings guarded by troops. To be fair, several local Muslim officials also tried to help, including a judge, Asad Bey, who assisted Armenians in fleeing and was later taken into custody and indicted. The local branch of the Anglo-American Relief Committee carefully tabulated casualty figures. Some 600 Armenians were killed, 9 Turks, 3 Greeks. Many women were raped, or as commonly described in those days, desecrated. About 1,500 houses were looted and 320 burned. By February 1896, some 6,000 Armenians, actually 5,700, from Trabzon and the surrounding countryside had fled the empire. I'll just hop on to the next period because it goes on and on. Sorry. A decade later, in 1908, when the CUP Young Turks took over, people thought that messianic times have arrived and that from now on, love and fraternity will reign. But soon relations soured between the CUP and the Christians and became even worse than after the 2 cruel Balkan Wars in 1912-1913. After the Ottoman defeat in early 1914, depredations began anew, mainly in revenge for the Balkan Wars. There were deportations of Greeks from the Aegean coast and the Ephesus area, but also from eastern Trabzon province. Many thousands were murdered during that time before the First World War. Many were slaughtered or sent for resettlement elsewhere, and quite a few youngsters escaped to Russia in the hope of finding a better life. But then very soon after, the war began, and the main target changed. The plan called for the destruction of the Armenian population, and the intention was clear: kill the men and hunger march the women south. Several Ottoman officials, including Lieutenant Ahmed Bas of the Ottoman army and Reshit Akif Pasha, who served briefly as the Ottoman cabinet after the war, told a similar story. After the initial innocent order of deportation was sent to the provinces, another order was circulated by the Central Committee to the governors and commanders so that the armed gangs could hastily complete their task of massacre. But what actually happened on the ground testifies more persuasively than any written order. When the deportation order reached Trabzon in late June 1915, it surprised no one. Horror stories had been emerging from Erzurum for more than a month. I should point out that many of Trabzon's Muslims opposed the deportation, especially of women and children, and in some cases there were family ties across religions. But officials were determined. According to the Vali, the deportees would be strictly forbidden to sell the rest of their possessions or even give them to neighbors and friends for safekeeping. Muslims would be forbidden from helping on pain of court-martial. All property left behind would be registered with authorities and would return to the deportees, and so on. I'll jump over some of this. The authorities arrested the Armenian notables. The Armenian bishop was sent south for interrogation and murdered in Gümüşhane on the way, and others, including leaders, teachers, businessmen, and Armenians with Russian passports, were dispatched by boat to Samsun to stand trial, but, quote unquote, met with an accident at sea and were never seen again. The American consul was told that this boat was met not far from Trabzon by another boat containing gendarmes. They proceeded to kill all the men and throw them overboard. On July 1, the rest of the Armenians were rounded up. Von Kwiatowski, Trabzon's Austrian consul and an ally to the Ottomans, wrote, considering the great distance of the deportation and lack of food and shelter along the infested route, banishment to Mosul is the equivalent of a death sentence. One of the most touching stories is that of children left behind. As the deportation deadline approached, panic took hold in Trabzon. Witnesses described frantic efforts to hide women and children. German, Austrian, and American consular officials did their best to rescue them. The consuls took the kids left behind and enrolled them in a new Muslim school to help save them. They even invited the Vali, the governor, to be the school's honorary president and the Greek metropolitan to be its vice president. But Nail Bey, the CUP's province secretary, basically the major CUP representative in the area, caught on to the ploy. He didn't shut down the school. Instead, he found a way to turn the situation to his advantage. He announced that in order to help these children, Muslims should take them in. Many did, including Nail Bey himself. According to the American consul Heiser, Nail Bey chose 10 of the best-looking girls and kept them in a house for his own pleasure and the amusement of his friends. Some of the boys remained in school, but later the perpetrators removed and added them to convoys heading south. Others were disposed of more brutally. I quote Heiser again, the American consul. Many of the children were loaded into boats and taken out to sea and thrown overboard. I myself saw where 16 bodies were washed ashore and buried by a Greek woman near the Italian monastery. This was corroborated by the Ottoman Lieutenant Bas, who admitted that the children were taken out to sea in little boats. At some distance out, they were stabbed to death, put in sacks, and thrown into the sea. The director of Trabzon's customs house, Haji Bekir Mehmet Ali Bey, was accused by the British of participating in that particular massacre. Anyway, I'll jump on to the period after the war because of shortage of time. During the war, there was also Greek deportations. Some were linked to the shifting tides of war. The Russians entered Trabzon Vilayet in April 1916, and as the regional Ottoman commander, Kamil Pasha, retreated, he ordered the deportation of Greek villagers towards the west, behind the lines. It was a cold spring, and some froze along the road. That spring and summer, the Ottomans deported the inhabitants of dozens of Trabzon Vilayet villages. Hundreds fled to the surrounding forests and to mountains. A Greek report tells of 26 women and girls who, to avoid dishonor, threw themselves into a river near the village of Gefira. Elsewhere in Trabzon Vilayet, they rounded up the Greek women and took them to Vazelon Monastery, where they first violated them and then put them to death. Many men were also murdered. A Greek metropolitan named Germanos described the raid by Osman Aga, an agent of Trabzon Valley Cemal Azmi and himself destined for infamy, on the village of Prosori as the army was in its retreat. They plundered the houses, raped the women, murdered 4 young Greeks, and beat the parish priests to death. Osman then forced the peasants to sign a document clarifying or certifying that the murderers were Armenians. In a later report, he wrote that a large number of women and children were killed, the young girls outraged and immediately driven into the interior. These girls had to march 30 or 40 days across snow-covered mountains and sleep by night in the open. The majority, of course, died on the road. We now move to the last part of the saga, under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. As the Mudros armistice was signed on October 30, the Christian inhabitants of Trabzon hoped for a better future, but their hopes were soon dashed. Even in the first quarter of 1919, right after the armistice, in the Trabzon and Samsun districts alone, dozens of Greeks and Armenians were murdered. The British High Commissioner suggested that repatriation of refugees be discontinued because of that murder, and at the end of the year in Platina, outside Trabzon, the only Armenians to return were assassinated shortly after their arrival. Little by little, Ataturk's forces captured the Black Sea coast. This was accelerated after the French forces were driven out of Cilicia in the south, and the nationalists could spare forces for the northern campaign. In early spring 1922, the Turks renewed the mass deportations. This was done slowly and hesitantly at first. In 1921, there appears to have been an earlier plan to get rid of the Greeks. At one point, the Trabzon nationalist leaders had collected hundreds of Christian boys aged 11 to 14. They were sent to an internment camp near Cevizlik, a nearby village. But prominent Cevizlik Muslims came to Trabzon to protest against the unparalleled inhumanity at the camp. The mayor and the new valley also reportedly opposed the massacres and persecutions, and the plan was stymied. However, they were ultimately powerless. By early May 1922, the Greek male population from the age of 15 upwards was being deported. Perhaps as a lesson from the previous bout of deportations of Armenians, they were deceived, told that they needed to enlist for work in fortification buildings, and then deported down south, inland, in groups of 50 every few days This will continue until the entire Greek male population is gone, he was told. We don't know what happened to the deportees, but we know from other places that those deportees almost were never seen afterwards. In the outskirts of the village of Jevizlik, mentioned earlier, 2 women witnessed 17 men beheaded. The soldiers ran a bayonet through from one ear to the other. A long stick was placed through each head, and then the soldiers paraded before the officers with these heads. Those 2 women also saw 4 girls from 15 to 18 years of age taken by officers for immoral purposes and then put to death. In addition, there were children 9, 10, and 12 years of age killed before their eyes. I'll jump to the end. In early November 1922, having pushed back the invading Greek army, the nationalist government announced that all non-Muslims left in the country had 1 month to leave. The implication was that if they failed to leave in time, they would be prevented thereafter from leaving or would be deported to the interior. A British consul commented, "This is done in pursuance of the policy that no Christians are allowed to stay in Turkey." In Samsun, Trabzon, and some other places, the Christians were explicitly told that they'd be deported to the interior if they failed to leave. The boats were loaded beyond capacity. In March 1923, some 3,000 refugees were awaiting boats in Trabzon. Meanwhile, Greece and Turkey signed the population exchange agreement. By that time, the great majority of Pontic Greeks were either dead or out of the country. The ones left were now herded to the port. The first installments of the exchange, supervised by NER, the American Relief Agency, took place in October, November 1923. By the end of 1923, Trabzon was totally purged of its Armenians and Greeks, and the long history of Christianity in the city was ended. As I'm sure you know, it hasn't stopped there. Even as late as 2013 and 90 years after the last Greeks and Armenians were sent away, the Turkish Ministry of Pious Foundations decided to turn Trabzon's Hagia Sophia, which was designated a museum in 1964, into a mosque, obliterating another remnant of that Christian past. Thank you.
Due to time